Hello everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Ellen and I'm the events coordinator here at Look. For anyone who doesn't know, Look is a small national charity supporting visually impaired children, young people and families through peer mentoring services and confidence building events. So during lockdown, we've been quite fortunate that the online mentoring has been able to continue because that was all kind of on an online platform anyway. So that's been able to carry on as normal and it's been very popular actually. And we've transferred all of our events online into this format. So, and that's been working really well. In terms of our work with students, our mentoring service is run by, the way we run our mentoring service is by connecting visually impaired young people with older visually impaired mentors, so young adults. And in terms of kind of services for students, we have a specific strand of the mentoring for uni students where we match VI young people who are thinking about university or who might just be about to start with another visually impaired graduate, so they can have that kind of support from a fellow visually impaired student who's kind of been through it all. And we've also been, at the start of this year, we started to develop our university handbook and our Get Uni Ready events. So our university handbook for visually impaired students is available on our website, and Get Uni Ready events are designed to give visually impaired young people a flavour of what it might be like to go to university. Obviously, they've been put on hold during lockdown, but we are hoping to pick those up again in the future. So through our kind of work with young people and particularly young people, visually impaired young people thinking about going to university, we know there's a lot of uncertainty and questions at the moment around either starting or going back to uni in September, which is why we are putting on this event. And in a moment, I'll hand over to Tiri, who is going to be our chair for this event this afternoon. The recording will be made available afterwards for you to listen back. And we'll also be making notes from this session and we'll link to any resources, and the notes will be available on the Look website afterwards. So that's everything from me for now. I'm now going to hand over to Tiri, who's going to introduce herself and our speakers.
I'm Tiri. I am myself a visually impaired student. I'm just going into my third year at Oxford University studying medicine. And on top of doing my degree, I also chair the Oxford SU Disabilities Campaign, which is basically it's a student-run campaign within the university representing disabled students. And we do a bit of campaigning within the university and also the city of Oxford, as well as organising socials and events for disabled students. So I'm going to be facilitating this Q&A session. This is a session for students. We do have other people who are here, which is great. We have parents, we have professionals, but because the session is primarily aimed at students, we're going to be prioritising questions from students, which we hope has the advantage of making sure students have a voice and also allowing those who are here who aren't students to understand things from the student perspective. But obviously, depending on time, we can definitely address questions from people who aren't students themselves. We're just going to prioritise time-wise if we start running out of time. So we are going to kind of have 3 subtopic sections just to try and have a sort of a clear layout of what's going to happen. So the first topic broadly will be learning and how visually impaired students are going to experience learning at university in the coming term and year with respect to changes relating to the coronavirus, and to have a discussion about things that people might be worried about in relation to learning. The second subtopic is orientation and mobility, talking about how these kind of things might be more difficult or changed, again, because of coronavirus. And then the third section is about accommodation, socialising and personal safety, how you're going to manage living, how you're going to manage having relatively normal social interactions while still maintaining all of the social distancing that is now in all of our lives. And also we're going to have a quick chat about access to testing for coronavirus as a visually impaired student. So we really want you to contribute questions and comments, or if you have a good idea about how to solve a problem someone else has brought up, that would be brilliant. But we're just going to try and keep it within those 3 topics. So if you've got a really good question, but it's about accommodation, if possible, wait till we get to the accommodation section. But if you're not quite sure where the question fits in, don't be afraid, just ask it, and we can always say, oh, we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So me personally, since lockdown has happened, there are lots of changes that I've found difficult, particularly all the social distancing measures in cities. And I actually live in Oxford, which is a very much university city, so everything's quite integrated. And a lot of the things that have been put in place I found really difficult, like one-way systems that I don't know which way round they go, and perspex barriers that I don't know are there until I've walked into them or tried to put my hand through them. As well as, personally, I've had a bit of an increase in guide dog access refusals because people are more worried about infection control, so therefore think that it's okay to refuse a guide dog. So these are some of the things that I'm worried about. But the point of this session is to try and get a bunch of students together, both current university students and people who are about to start, and talk about things you're worried about, and hopefully either suggest some ways of solving them, but more likely they're going to be things where we're going to talk about ways to talk to your university and find ways around them, because everyone's university is a bit different, everyone's individual needs are a bit different. So most of it's just going to be general advice on how to go about trying to mitigate these issues. So I'm just going to hand over to Will now, who's going to introduce himself.
Cool, yeah, so I'm Will. I am an Access and Outreach Coordinator at the University of Winchester. So my role entails supporting students actually mostly before they get to university. So I do a lot of going out into the community, talking to people from different backgrounds who may or may not want to go to university, and talking to them about the support that is available there to them. In terms of myself as an individual, I'm not visually impaired, however I am hearing impaired. So I am a bone anchored hearing aid user. So I have some experience of being in some of those meetings that can be quite nerve-wracking at times, and also when you're trying to get your message across around the support and advice and guidance that you need. Also, in a previous role, I too was involved in student union work. I was the Equality and Diversity Officer whilst I was at university. And also, from a young age, I've been a public speaker and advocate for anything to do with representation, making sure that absolutely everybody has a fair and equal opportunity to succeed and go on to do whatever they want to go and do. In terms of universities, though, in the current climate that we're in, it is a mixed bag. And just to say that throughout this event today, I hope that you do come away with some sort of nuggets of information that you can use. And if you're a student, that you'll know the next steps that you need to go on or what to expect in the future. But if you're a professional as well, in terms of stealing some ideas that you might hear today, because this is also a great opportunity for us to come together with a kind of like a one voice, making sure that we all understand the challenge that is ahead of us, but also how we can together overcome that. And we hope to be able to support students, especially throughout this kind of period. So you're going to hear me a lot saying that universities are going to be dealing with things differently, but I do hope that I'll be able to give you some answers and sort of a direction that you could probably expect most people to be going down. So thank you very much. That's me.
Hi everyone, my name's Molly. I work for Thomas Pocklington Trust Student Support Service. We're a really new service, so firstly I think it's probably helpful if I tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we do. So we launched in April officially. We're a national service who work to support students entering and throughout their time in further education and then higher education. And our overall aim is to help you get the very most you can out of your time in education. There are lots of different elements to our service. So we started off by building up a bank of resources for students, for their families, for universities and other professionals, just provide some guidance and a reference point to some of these issues that we're all facing, and to share best practice, because we're firm believers that coming together and sharing these ideas is definitely a really strong way forward to preventing and being proactive about these things. We also have an email inbox and support line where we can offer one-to-one support. If you've got a specific query or a support case that needs some kind of one-to-one assistance, we can provide that for you. We also hold events such as this, and we have a Facebook community, so that gives another platform to share information or just have a conversation with someone who's got experience about being in a similar situation to yourself. And then we have a policy and campaigning side where when we identify issues that are affecting lots of students, we hope to elevate that voice of students with vision impairments, consult on government proposals, or just raise awareness of different issues and collate evidence so that we can argue for improvements that are needed. A little bit about me personally. I began working with TPT about a few years ago now, when I moved to London for university. I've recently just completed my studies for a BA degree in business management at Pearson Business School. So I have got first-hand experience of being a student and studying in this current situation, which I really enjoy putting to use within my work. And I look forward to sharing some tips and advice that we've picked up by working with different students in universities in this current time, as well as my own personal experience of studying, just to try and help answer lots of your questions.
Great, thanks. So I think we are basically ready to get started on starting to chat about some of the issues that have come up. We're going to start, like I said, with the topic of learning. And to kind of define that, we're basically talking about your academic teaching, whether that's normally lectures, normally small group teaching, whether you have labs, whether you have practicals, that sort of thing, things to do with your actual degree that you're doing. So some people sent in questions or discussion points beforehand, which is really useful. So we've kind of incorporated them. But at any point, if you have something to add or another question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand like Ellen described, and has also left some instructions in the chat that you can read on how to kind of get involved, because otherwise you'll get bored of me talking all the time. So one thing that we identified quite early on was that most universities are thinking about essentially having a blended approach to learning, which basically means a combination of in-person and online teaching. And personally, I have found doing the last summer term entirely online, some pros for me, which were there was recorded lectures. And before, if I missed something in a lecture, it was gone, it was never recorded, and I never got to learn that bit of information. Whereas these, I can stop, I can rewind. And because they are synced in with the PowerPoints, I can both see and hear the lecture at the same time. Whereas normally I sit in a lecture and listen, and then later try and write up notes and combine what I think I remember hearing with a PowerPoint I can now see on my laptop. So that was an improvement for me, and we've been trying to get recorded lectures at Oxford regardless of coronavirus for many years, so we're really hoping this is a change that can carry on beyond when normal teaching returns. But of course there are issues with that. Just not being in the room with somebody does make things harder, and people who use note takers, as many visually impaired students do, it's hard to know exactly how to use a note taker when you're both accessing something online. So I wonder if anyone has any questions or comments on blended approaches to learning, and also on non-medical helpers, so note takers, for instance, within the learning setting. It would be great if you could send them in. Oh, we have one. With some lectures having moved online, how do you anticipate note takers, such as those provided through DSA, to be able to best support visually impaired students? Personally, I actually don't use a note taker, just because my degree is very scientific and it would have been hard to find somebody who understood all the science, so I prefer to listen and then write my own notes. But so many disabled students, not just visually impaired students, use note takers. I think some information must actually be known about this. So I'm going to ask Will to come in here.
It really does depend as you as an individual as well, in the move across to recorded sessions. And there may be other ways that you can use things such as the DSA, and also how much you anticipate using a note taker. It might be that you feel that you'd actually want a note taker present more so in those face-to-face learning sessions, and everything that is done online you're happy and you're confident to do by yourself. So that would involve certainly a conversation with your university. The universities will still try and put together a package that works best for you. And so it's vitally important that if having a note taker is important to you, that you have that conversation and you start having that conversation as soon as possible. It's worth noting as well, though, the use of note takers in any of the physical spaces will have to be included in any numbers or capacities when it comes to rooms, because universities will be developing their timetables thinking about the capacity of a room. And so it's very important when talking to your university and saying whether or not you'll need a note taker, that you do make sure as well that you follow up and say that this is another person that's going to be present. Also thinking about how are you going to work with the note taker online. If you are both accessing a resource online, are you then going to arrange another point to meet socially distanced apart to discuss anything, or are you just going to simply rely on anything that's going to come from the note taker to you, as it might be that that's normally what happens. So it's very important to have that conversation and to start thinking about actually, when is best for me to have a note taker.
Thanks. There is definitely more to cover on the blended approach to learning, but I'm just going to add in another thing that we identified before this as something that might be an issue, which was for actual in-person seminars, tutorials, anything that is happening face-to-face. As Will has just said, there will be the universities will need to make sure that there's not too many people per room and set out social distancing guidelines within those locations. But as visually impaired students, how will we go about finding a socially distanced seat? How will we go about changing classrooms? And at this point, we sort of cross over with the mobility section we're going to come to later. And how do we make sure that we can, for those of us who have usable vision and need to get closer to things, to see them, how will we make sure we can get closer without breaking social distancing guidelines? And, they're not just guidelines, it's to keep us safe and everyone else safe as well. So I personally would hope that, there's going to be enough support from the staff giving those seminars that they can direct people to seats, but it is obviously harder while also maintaining social distancing. Within that, there's also the issue, as we've talked about, with note takers, and they're one type of non-medical helper. There are, of course, others. I think note takers are probably those that are most likely to be directly involved with learning, but some people have the specialist support for visually impaired students, and I know most people who have that already have started moving online, but whether you can get the same level of support online, if anyone's worried about that, would be interesting to hear. And also people, especially who are starting new at university, who are due to have training with new technology as part of a non-medical helper scheme with DSA, or mobility training, which we'll also come on to. Our understanding is that it's not going to be something that can happen face-to-face. Clearlinks, who are one of the sort of biggest companies that provide non-medical helpers in this sense, have said that they won't be doing any face-to-face contact until at least January. So how can we make sure that students are getting the most that they can out of all of their lectures and teaching, even if that's in person, when they may not have a note taker that can go with them to their lectures? We haven't got any more questions so far. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to say on kind of what I've talked about so far, Will?
Just to say that, as I said at the beginning as well, every university is going to be different, and there is going to be some things that some universities do that others don't. And that could be a very wide range of things. For example, at Winchester, we are going by the 2 metre rule. But a lot of people are suggesting it's this 1 metre plus, so that's 1 metre plus mitigation, and others are going down a purely online route. So it is a great mix. As well as room layout and making sure that everyone is, at Winchester, this is a case of being 2 metres apart, making sure that everyone is distant in a room layout. That is one thing that universities are doing. Another thing is timetables. So when you do have a face-to-face session, it might be expected that you will be going into buildings and leaving buildings at different times to everybody else. So that could mean that your sessions might be finishing and starting at slightly funny times, you know, sort of like maybe at 10 to or 5 minutes to the hour, and then you're leaving at 25 minutes past. Also on top of that is the technology that is available in the rooms as well. So we mentioned a bit about technology that you might be accessing, thinking about some of the recordings. It might be that some sessions that will be delivered in person will also be recorded. And so it's important that you have a conversation to say about where you feel is safe. You may not fit under one of the sort of the high risk categories in terms of respiratory issues, but it's all about where you feel safe. So yet again, it's making sure you have that conversation with somebody, and because you going in, it might be that actually everything about you going in is okay, it's fine, but you don't feel comfortable there. And at the end of the day, it's your learning, so you need to make sure that you speak to somebody about how you are feeling about it. So it's not necessarily all about the practicalities. You might not even get to that stage because your anxiety or something like that.
Thanks. I mean, you touched on technology there. I just wanted to share a comment that's been put in the chat. It's not a question, but it's a useful thing, so I'll read it out for anyone who's not following the chat. It says, "Hi, I just wanted to pass on a tip for anyone using the Sonosant audio note taker software. Normally you'd have the recording source set to microphone. I found for an online lecture, changing the audio source to microphone plus speaker works really well." So that's really good to know actually for anyone using that software, because obviously audio coming out of a computer is quite different than coming out of a person's mouth at the other end of a lecture theatre. So thanks for sharing that. You also touched on talking to faculties and things there, Will, which was the next thing I kind of had identified to talk about. Because I think, as you said, really the most important thing is identifying what you as visually impaired students are comfortable doing. And if you're all expected to go in person to a seminar but you don't feel comfortable with that, even if, as Will said, you're not clinically in the shielding group, I think that has to be respected, because it is harder to social distance when you can't see how far someone is away from you. So I have personally already been in contact with my faculties about how I'm going to go about getting to places and doing things while keeping myself safe and also everyone else safe. I'm luckily spending most of the term in labs, so I should just be with a very small group of people in quite a clinically clean environment, because everyone will already be wearing masks and gloves. So that's been really helpful for me. But I know of friends who do humanities subjects where they are almost entirely just in lectures or seminars who are more worried about that. So I would definitely advise just getting in touch with people at your university as soon as possible, even if you don't think there are going to be any issues for you, just to make yourself known and say, this could be a problem potentially. I'm just aware that with people raising hands and on the chat, there might be a bit of a delay between when you think of a question and when we've talked about it. So absolutely feel free to ask a question, even if we seem to have moved on from that topic, either by the chat or by raising your hand. We also had within the learning topic to talk about exams. Hopefully most people will have exams in the summer, because that's usually how universities work. Personally, I have them in about a month, because I was meant to do exams at the end of the summer term, but they were postponed. And I know some other people are in the same situation. And some people do subjects at universities where they just happen to get tested more frequently. And if those are going to be moved online, something that we identified as possibly being an issue was if new online platforms are being used, have they undergone user testing by screen reader users, screen magnification users, and any other assistive tech that people use, Dragon, that sort of thing. Particularly, as I said, in the case of exams that were always previously done on paper or, you know, with a reader scribe in the room and you would type onto a computer or something like that. If they're now being done entirely online, how do we make sure that people can actually access those, and how do we make sure that no one ends up in a situation where they are last minute sat in an exam where they can't access anything? Because we obviously don't want that to happen, and it's a risk when you use assistive technology that something just won't be compatible with it. So again, I mean, this comes back to communicating with your faculty. Personally, I would say if you have exams anytime in the next year, it's worth bringing it up now and just asking what their current plans are on exams. And also, you know, making sure, especially if you're a new student at university, making sure that your access needs for exams are well understood by the faculty or whoever's providing the exams. So we don't have any more questions at the moment, so I'm gonna just go to Molly first, and then I'll come back to Will. So Molly, if you have any advice on exams, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is arguably the biggest area of university life that's had to change, that has such a significant impact on like the academic achievement and that side of your degree. And we have had lots of students and universities coming to us with questions on the best ways to approach this, because as you say, lots of assessments have very traditionally either been very paper-based, or for like presentations, they've always been conducted live in person, and all of those things have had to change really quickly. So unfortunately, yes, we have had some students experience some quite significant difficulties. One of the ways that universities have moved learning online is to use online portals. A Blackboard is a popular one, but there's lots of different ones out there available. And some of these aren't accessible. We've had students who, because they haven't received the visual cues when submitting work, because they haven't been read out or triggered their screen reader, they have been totally unaware that their coursework was not uploaded successfully, and they have had issues completing their modules because of that. We've had students who have been had trouble with presentations because they haven't been sure how to set up the camera and the microphone to the right requirements that the exam board or the regulators need it to be. And lots of remote exam platforms, they say they might be accessible, but they aren't necessarily compatible with the assistive technology that you've already got or that you're used to using. And just because they're accessible doesn't necessarily mean they're easy to navigate, which in a very stressful situation like being an exam is super important. So I would really like to second Tiri's points on saying, make sure that you communicate really, really far in advance. Make sure you know the plan, make sure you know all of the systems that the university is considering, and that they understand what you need from your reasonable adjustments and why, because that really helps them then narrow down and filter out any of the kind of options that they're considering that aren't going to work for you. And if you can, test them out as soon as you can. And if you are finding them difficult to navigate, ask for someone to run training, ask for someone to just run through with you the key commands that you're going to need to know, because that's just going to help you feel really confident and comfortable going into these assessments. And it means that if there are any issues, like it's just really not accessible or compatible, we've got plenty of time to work through and find an alternative fair solution that means that you can compete on that equal platform for your assessments.
Thanks, Molly. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, Will?
Not an awful lot, really. It's just, yeah, again, just emphasising that, you know, communication. The other thing to mention around exams is exam prep as well, and just thinking about any of the resources that you might need for an exam, where that's any reading that you have to do beforehand, anything about libraries and things like that. There will be different things in place, such as sort of like limited touching of certain resources, and also the use of kind of face coverings and stuff, which we'll cover in the orientation and mobility section, I'm sure. But yeah, just making sure you talk and you communicate, and you speak to someone about any of the concerns. I would say as well, for any of the professionals in the room, it's not about you going straight to a visually impaired student and saying, I've got to help you. It's just making sure that you keep that door open, so that any student from any background, VI or not, knows that they can come and talk to you about any concerns that they have. And certainly if you have that relationship with any students, making sure that you do have that conversation, but certainly don't go singling out students, but making sure that you keep that door open. It may be slightly different in the current climate, so it might not be a physical door open, where they can come and see you in an office. It might be, arrange a time to have a one-to-one with me, but make sure that students know that if you are available to talk, that that they can come and talk to you
as well. So we have a couple of questions in the chat now. So we have one from Abby on this learning subtopic. So it says, I'm on a course which involves a physical placement. I have an educator who at first helps me round before I can get used to the layout of wards. I also have to sit quite close to actually see what they're doing. Do you have any suggestions for adaptations I can do to achieve my placement without having to get too close to either patient or my educator? So, I mean, I'm a medical student, so I really relate to the kind of things you're talking about in this question. Luckily, it's not going to be an issue this term, but I'm going to have to think about similar things sort of as of after Christmas. And I mean, personally, things that I've started to ask questions about are, can I wear more or higher quality PPE, the masks and gloves and things, so that if I am closer, it's less of an issue. And also, I'm looking to get reassessed by the sort of low vision support team that can do monoculars and things like that, so I can try and achieve the same level of vision but from slightly further away, because I haven't used a monocular that much in the last few years, apart from at train stations, because I just get closer to the thing I need to see at uni. But if that's not always going to be an option because of patient safety, I'm hoping that I can get assessed for some equipment that will help me to sit further away but achieve the same thing. So that's just my opinion as a visually impaired student, with no professional weighting behind it. But I don't know if Will or Molly have any suggestions about that kind of quite specific scenario.
It is a very specific scenario, isn't it? And yeah, I would just say it's very similar along those lines. Find other alternatives and things like that. But yeah, again, making sure you keep in communication in this case as well. Talking to any patients as well, making sure that they feel safe as well as you, and making sure that everyone in the room it just feels safe.
Yeah, we've been working with a physics student recently who's not quite the same, but still has a lot of experiments and things to like that you need to get quite close to notice slight changes, and with Bunsen burners or dangerous gases, that's already quite dangerous to get too close to. So she uses an iPad actually, and she uses the camera on it to zoom in, to enlarge the screen so she can get a really close-up view. That might be something that you could apply to your course. And also she just found that having a conversation with whoever's around you that's providing some sighted assistance, whether that be a specialist provider or just the people you're kind of working with within your group, having a conversation early on about what kind of things that you like to know about what's going on, or for them to point out to you, that can be really helpful, so that people know what kind of descriptions you need, and just kind of verbal instructions that might be really helpful to you. Yeah, that's about as close a comparison as I can give, I'm afraid.
Great, thank you. Yeah, like I said at the beginning of this, with really specific scenarios, often the answer is just going to be that you're going to have to talk to your university. But I hope it's at the very least reassuring to know that other people are having similar worries, and it's not just you who's worried about something. Sorry, that's my email tone going off. I can't turn it off without losing audio. So I think that really wraps up the sort of learning subtopic. If anyone thinks of any questions later, that's absolutely fine. Just send them in the chat and we'll come to them. But we already have a question in the chat about the next subtopic, which is orientation and mobility. So we're thinking about mobility support, especially for new university students who have yet to have any mobility training around where they're living and their campus, as well as changes within cities and local areas, because obviously, although you're a student, you also need to go to the shops and go to the bank, and how to manage all of those kind of things. Changes on campus, including, you know, one-way systems, or the perspex screens that are my mortal enemy at the moment, as well as we're going to have a quick chat about some guide dog specific changes. So the question we have in the chat from Najida is, what about sighted guide? And this is a really important question, because although a note taker, you can imagine that they could do the same job online, whereas a sighted guide, it doesn't really work like that. So I'd really like to go to Will or Molly on this one, actually. What should people do if they need sighted guide to get around?
So yeah, this is definitely a concern, again, that's come up from both students and universities, because traditionally it's something that's provided through DSA, and the providers are saying no face-to-face services will be conducted this academic year. So some of the alternatives that are available, we've kind of put forward. There's lots of technology now that can be really helpful. I won't list all of them now because there's lots, and it would be helpful to have links. So I'll make sure that Ellen has lots of links to all the information in the notes that are distributed after this. But there are all kinds of different gadgets or even mobile apps that can be really helpful to give some of that sighted instruction that you need. And universities have said that if sighted guidance and like physical contact isn't allowed, you can still arrange for someone to meet you at certain destinations on campus and just walk with you and give, again, verbal instructions if that would be helpful to you. Lots of people are saying that they'll try and keep that within your social bubble, or keep it down to a minimum of one member of staff, if at all possible, just because it is a concern for both parties that that's going to increase risk, even if a distance it is possible to keep a distance while doing that. So I think technology is definitely one of the best way forwards, and is what a lot of our students are going to use in September.
In regards to you know, the need for sighted guides, it's we're going to come back to this all the time. It's about having that conversation, but there will be scenarios where you know, some people, whether that be universities or other students around as well, or wherever you are on the campus, where it may not, you might not feel comfortable with a sighted guide, the sighted guide might not feel comfortable as well, or others, and it is about trying to make sure that everybody feels safe. So just have a thought about the kind of places where it is going to be most useful to you to have a sighted guide. Certainly very early on, if you're starting at university, or if you're returning to the campus, it might be a good idea to arrange some time with a sighted guide to get yourself kind of used to the university campus. But as I said, it's going to be about having that conversation. But I would also say technology is fantastic and it's great. Make sure that you do use as much of it as you feel comfortable using. But we as universities as well completely accept that not everything can be replaced by technology.
Thanks for that, both of you. I mean, personally, I'm going into my third year, so I had all of the mobility training kind of at the beginning, and I know most of my routes, but I am living somewhere different this year. And normally I would kind of call guide dogs, because I have a guide dog and they can provide mobility training. But although they are still providing some of this, I am kind of hesitant to ask if I could achieve the same thing myself. And I'm hoping that I can ask friends who I already have at university to just walk the route with me, because personally, having already been there for 2 years, I don't think I need mobility support specifically. I just need someone to walk the route with me the first few times, and, you know, somebody just who has better vision than I do. So that might be a solution for some people, depending on, you know, if you've already been at a university for a few years, if you have friends who would be willing to do that with you, particularly those who you will need to be social bubbling with at university anyway. The same potentially for family members. I mean, obviously it's not ideal to not have mobility support and have a family member do it with you, but it's not really an ideal situation at the moment. So I've heard of a couple of people saying they're going to visit their university in advance with a parent who they're already in a social bubble with, and walk through the routes in advance of the start of term. But as has already been said, there's not really an ideal solution, because it depends on who's providing the mobility. It depends on what type of mobility support you need. So the main thing really would be to get in touch with the people providing it, and find out what they're actually able to do. And I would say best to do that as soon as possible. We also identified all these changes that are happening all over the world, but on campuses as well, and even more so because, you know, there's this massive influx of students, often from all over the world. So naturally people are a bit worried about everyone getting ill. So lots of places, including town centres as well as universities, have introduced one-way systems, and sort of these have been painted on pavements or put up on the edge of lampposts, and often are not accessible in any way. And people, I mean, I've ended up on the wrong side of a road and someone said, oh, it's a one-way system. And also, as I've said already, the perspex barriers that are sort of separating, say, two sides of a pavement from left and right, or two sides of a corridor, these are often totally unmarked and very easy to walk into, and a bit of a safety hazard, in my opinion. I personally, so far, have sent emails to people within my university to say, what are you planning on doing for social distance marking, you know, the 2 meters away markers on the floors, for instance, and have you considered how these could be best adapted for visually impaired people? Personally, I really hate the ones that are a long line, because I see them in the sort of corner of my eye and I think there must be a step that I've never seen before, and then I sort of jolt my leg as I prepare for this step that actually doesn't exist, because they use the same tape that's often used to mark stairs. The ones that I personally prefer are the really big spots on the floor that show you this is your spot, and if you move 2 meters away there's another spot. Obviously it really depends on your level of vision, and tactile markings would also be ideal potentially, but I would advise getting in touch with your university as soon as possible, because if they haven't already put social distancing things in, you might be able to slightly influence, especially in your department or where you're living, how they're going to do that. Just in the chat we have a suggestion from Abby. As a suggestion, would Be My Eyes app be a good idea for walking the route for the first few times alone if you're confident to do so? And yeah, I think that's a really good alternative. Like what Will was saying about technology, not quite as good as the real thing, but it can help. And if you know how to use Be My Eyes, or even if you don't, you can read about it and download it. I've heard a lot of good reviews about it, so I think that would be a good thing to consider.
That's definitely one I was going to recommend.
Oh, really? That's good. Do you have anything on you know, changes on campus, Molly?
Yeah, so again, like you said, it's not really on an individual level. This is definitely more towards the universities, and everyone's going to have their own approach and would have started making their own plans. So universities that have come forward to us, some things that we've recommended are using tactile techniques wherever possible. So you can get tactile tape, and even if we can't get tactile, like Tiri Hughes said, we're trying to discourage using the yellow tape that normally indicates a level change, because it's just confusing. You can also use physical objects to kind of block out seats that are perhaps unavailable or need to be left empty in lecture halls, just so that there is a tactile barrier there. that not just like a sign or something that is going to be easily missed. On the wider side, like the routes around campus, we are just trying to say, like, keep as consistent as possible. Obviously, it's really helpful to everyone if you're going to be navigating different areas of the campus. If there's some kind of consistency, like the road direction, so like you stay on whatever the right side of the corridor to you, or anything like that, that can just make it a little bit easier to remember and to know where you need to be. And to try and just make sure that all students have the notifications they need of any changes. There are going to be changes to these different systems. There's going to be routes that you used to take that you couldn't take if you're a returning student. There's going to be entrances that close or open at different times. That means that you can't necessarily rely on that one route that you normally use. So we are just encouraging everyone to kind of communicate those changes if they can. Some have introduced a Facebook group, so they'll post on there any kind of changes that be made on site on campus, or others have just offered to email students to let them know if there have been any changes or new measures introduced. So that can be really helpful. And for students, I just recommend if you think that's going to be something that's helpful, or if you just want to know what the plans are for the university, reach out, ask what their plans are, and don't be afraid to ask for someone to email you to let you know, or just describe what kind of changes there have been on campus, just so you're prepared for when you're on site.
Thanks. There's another question related to this from Abby saying, I struggle to find an empty seat with social distancing. Do you have, without social distancing, do you have any recommendations on finding one in a socially distanced manner? So this kind of links to what you were saying about asking universities to make sure that they show which seats are in use and which ones aren't in a clearer way than just a sign. The first thing that pops into my head is to also ask them to make sure that they're consistent, that they, for the whole term, they say these are the seats in use and these are the ones not in use. So if you're using the same classroom repeatedly, you know where seats are that are meant to be seats, and you know where the seats that are supposed to be out of use are. And also potentially asking to have a designated seat that is yours, so people, they can just put a sign on it, because it's mostly going to be for sighted people to see that that's your seat and not to sit there. And then you could go to your seat without having to sort of bustle past everyone and find an empty one. But I don't know if Molly or Will, you have any better guidance on that than what I've just said.
Not an awful lot. It's really, a lot of it is going to be about that orientation, and it's probably going to feel quite overwhelming in the first instance. Certainly trying to get used to the one-way systems, as well as trying to find places where you're actually going to sit when you get to your destination, is going to be a challenge. So there will be a lot of communication there, and certainly do talk to your universities around, you know, what your needs are, and you know how you would suggest helping. Universities and any organisation really should be listening to you and listening to what you believe is best for you, and then coming up with a solution. It might be that in each scenario you're never going to get, you know, what you want every time, but by talking to them, you can maybe say, okay, when I go to this kind of this space, can I reserve a table? Can I reserve a chair? What can I do to make sure that when I arrive somewhere, that there is going to be somewhere for me to work? Alongside that as well is, just to add on to the stuff around the one-way systems, is making sure you know about the safest routes as well. You're both completely right in the fact that everything that I've seen is completely inaccessible in regards to the stuff that's been put in place for social distancing. But just remember as well that the quickest way to get somewhere, or the most convenient way, may not be the safest way for you. So think about what is the safest route for you. Think about what is the safest place in a room for you as well. If you're planning to sit somewhere in a room and you have no idea what's going on around you, then you might want to sit to one side. You might want to sit you know, somewhere else within the room that is more kind of convenient for you. it's also just to point out as well, actually, you mentioned about the social distancing manner that you might go around in as well. The use of face coverings, particularly in certain areas, they may be mandatory, in other areas they might not be. So that also might make your mind up about where you want to go in terms of your work, whether that be sort of in a library or in another social learning space. There certainly will be some places where it will be mandatory to wear a face covering, and others where it's not. And each university is going to be completely different in their approach to that.
So the last thing I have listed to talk about under mobility is specifically about guide dogs. So this might not apply to everyone, but some of the advice could be a bit more general. But obviously, if you have any other questions about orientation and mobility, feel free to send them in or raise your hand. So personally, I have a guide dog, and I have noticed just in and around Oxford, going to shops and commercial places, that I've had more access refusals, not total refusals like you can't come in, but stopping you at the door and saying, oh, we have to go and check with the manager. And I think it's because, there are all these new regulations in shops now, like certain number of people maximum and everyone wearing a mask and distancing. And a lot of people seem to assume that means that guide dogs are no longer allowed. And I've had to be quite strict with people and say that the law hasn't changed regarding guide dogs and it's all still the same. And really sort of had to stick up for myself in that respect more than I have had to before coronavirus. So, I mean, I don't know if anyone else has had similar experiences or different ones. I know some people have found that they've had fewer access refusals because people are less likely to physically come towards you. But universities should know better, essentially, because in shops, usually the people who are causing an issue are not the managers of the shops. They're just somebody who hasn't received the right training. So I would say if you are a guide dog user, then going to speak to your university and just saying, can you send emails to all the places I'm going, just reminding them in advance that my guide dog is allowed to come everywhere with me, with obvious certain laboratory exemptions included. It is something that I've done, even though I've been at the university for 2 years, just to remind people that the law hasn't changed in that respect at all. So we haven't got any other questions on this, but we do have a suggestion from Abby, which is a really good suggestion. Says, I recommend using the sunflower lanyard to show others that you struggle to social distance. The lanyard is not directly linked to COVID, but I find it helps me a lot with others realising. So for those of you who don't know, the sunflower lanyard is a scheme that was set up well before COVID, and it was essentially used to show that someone might need a bit of extra help in relation to usually an invisible disability. And a visual impairment could be visible or invisible depending on lots of things. If you use a cane or you have a guide dog, then people usually know what that means. But if you don't, then people might not know that you have a visual impairment at all. And I know a lot of people who have used the sunflower lanyard scheme to, in the past before coronavirus, just to show that they might need a bit of extra help. And there's been a massive upsurge in its use since social distancing measures have been brought about. And you can get a little card that attaches saying something like, I struggle to social distance, or I'm visually impaired, please give me space, that sort of thing. I know some universities are introducing their own version of that system, or they're encouraging students to get a sunflower lanyard. Some people might not be comfortable kind of outwardly identifying themselves in that way, especially if you don't use a cane or a guide dog, so your visual impairment might be invisible to a lot of people. But I think if it's something you would be confident to do, it's definitely worth considering. I don't know, Will, if that's something that you've talked about at Winchester.
It's something certainly that is mentioned, and I think a lot of universities recognise, especially the sunflower one is the big one. But you are right in the fact that some students at other universities are encouraged to wear something that maybe just is an indicator for somebody just to pause, take a moment, and not to assume that something something that means you can't access or do something. I think it's also on that note as well. You said it before. The law on advice and guidance hasn't changed. So in terms of guide dogs, that certainly hasn't changed. But what we have recognised, and especially it's frustrating to some extent, that a global pandemic really puts a spotlight on certain issues. And so this certainly has been an opportunity for things like the Sunflower Lanyards and other schemes out there to put a spotlight on those kind of things. And certainly I've noticed, as I've been going about, more people wearing one of those lanyards or wearing something along those lines. So just to say, if you're feeling, okay, shouldn't I use one, get a lanyard or something like that, just know that you're not the only one. And there will be others out there, but of course it's all down to your confidence and how you feel about it and how confident you are about kind of saying that to the world. I think everybody understands why you may not want to, but yeah, just make sure as well that you know what your university is advising.
I very much agree. I mean, like you said, there's lots of different options. There's lanyards and cards. There's badges that I've seen available as well. They can be really helpful if you're going to be using public transport at all to get to and from campus, as well as around campus. People have found that people get frustrated very quickly if they don't understand why you aren't socially distanced, why you're getting closer to them than they'd feel comfortable. And it can be really helpful to have that kind of visual cue to them to give you some space and to show more patience. And also it takes the pressure off you having to explain yourself all the time. So yeah, as has been said, it's completely understandable why you wouldn't necessarily want to wear one, and no one should feel pressured to. It can be a really effective solution if you do feel comfortable using it, because it just takes a lot of stress out of moving around these new places.
Thanks. So we have a question in the chat from Abby, which is a really nice link to our next big topic of accommodation and socialising. So Abby's basically said, I'm on the list for a guide dog and mainly concerned about being refused for my house as they don't seem to get blind. They keep asking for my driving licence, which I'm sure is something a lot of us have experienced, being asked for a driver's licence despite having a guide dog or a white cane right there. Obviously with this comment, it's unpredictable if I will get a guide dog this year, but there is still that chance. So this is something which is, even aside from coronavirus, is an issue. And I think a lot of us who have guide dogs know that getting housing can be more difficult. Although you're not allowed to be discriminated against, it doesn't mean that landlords don't try because they don't necessarily want to have a dog. That being said, some people are really nice about it, so I can understand your worries, given that they don't seem to understand blindness because they keep asking for your driving license, that they might not be very understanding about a guide dog. I would say the moment you know more about when you're going to get one is to ask the guide dogs advocacy team if they can help you, because they're really good at talking to places and like shops and things and educating them. So I imagine they could do the same with a landlord. I don't know, Molly, if you have anything on that from TPT's point of view. That's kind of a pervasive issue that's not it's not a new issue, but probably made worse by coronavirus.
Yeah, exactly. It's something that's come up plenty of times before, and it is a bit of an ongoing issue. I mean, and not only landlords, but other people in shared accommodation. We've had students complaining about there being a dog around and them saying, oh, if they're allergic or anything like that, just because they're not comfortable having that dog in the shared flat or in the same level as they're living. So that has caused issues. Like you said, it's about knowing that the law is on your side, and the guide dogs themselves are brilliant. If there are any issues like that, get in touch with them, and they've got teams of people who can work with these people to work out any kind of issues, if there are changes that need to be made, or like for example, if someone does have an allergy, just having either them or you move to a different flat so you can avoid contact. There are lots of different solutions that can be implemented. It's all about reaching out and getting that support and knowing that people are on your side to make sure that this is still possible. It can't be that it's just that you're refused. it's just finding a way around it.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, is just sort of, there's a lot of support out there for this kind of issue, but just making sure that you access it.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned shared living spaces there, and that's something which has been raised as potentially an issue. Universities are planning different ways to try and have social bubbles. For instance, one flat will social bubble together, or one staircase in a set of rooms will bubble together. But this does have implications for various things, like, for instance, shared bathrooms. How will they be cleaned? Whose responsibility is it? And being visually impaired, there are more risks. You know, if people start leaving bleach out and you fall over it, that's not ideal. If things aren't clean but you can't see that they're not clean enough, that's also not ideal. And also, I think everyone who's going back to university, regardless of disability, is worried about how they're going to socialise when they're only supposed to social bubble with this small group of people. Obviously, you can see other people, but you have to maintain social distance. So, I mean, yeah, if anyone has any comments, concerns about that, then do put them in the chat or raise your hand. Social opportunities more generally, especially for students who've just started or just about to start at a university. Normally there would be a freshers fair and you can see all the societies and clubs that you can join. I assume most universities aren't running normal freshers fairs because they're very busy with lots of people in a small space, and I imagine they're the worst possible thing for social distancing. There are probably different ways around it. Oxford, for example, is doing a sort of online walkthrough type freshers fair, which may be more accessible than the normal one, because you should have a list that you can actually access with a screen reader or a magnifier of all of the societies, rather than just having to look out for the stall. But equally, it's a new website, and I've already raised some concerns about the digital accessibility of that. And I imagine that might be an issue at other universities. I don't know what you've thought about Freshers Fair so far at Winchester, Will?
Yeah, so Winchester is going to be a virtual event. But I think something as well, just to mention as well, whilst we were talking about bubbling and the accommodation, it's probably a good point to mention that when you are looking to go to university, some people are opting to stay at home and commuting in and trying to find ways around that. But yeah, a lot of student accommodation will be available, and that's probably actually going to be if you're new to university, one of the first things you engage with, as well as things like the freshers events that will be very, very different. And I can't speak about private accommodation, but in terms of university accommodation, or what you might expect from some of the university accommodation providers, is going to be slightly different as well when you arrive. So things like moving in, there may not be the same support that there might have been in previous years with student helpers. Also, you're talking about the bubbles and the households. Trying to find a group of students who are all on the same course, doing the same modules, perhaps with the same extracurricular activities, means that it's actually very difficult to create bubbles that you'll be expected to go around with. So for a lot of universities, it will be a case of treating them as households. So typically actually how the government treats us in terms of the household that we're in. So if you're in an accommodation, for example, where it's just you, then you can have a support bubble with another household. But that's the only situation where you can have that close contact support bubble as a household. It's worth mentioning, though, that all the other social activities that will be going on, you can do with other people. It doesn't always have to be with your household, but it has to be following the guidance that is out there. So it might feel a little bit odd doing a quiz, maybe like a big quiz kind of thing, but you have to be 2 meters apart from all your teammates, and then also having to be 2 meters apart from all the other teams as well. So it can be very interesting, and certainly you won't be able to whisper the answers across to each other. So there's going to be some new and innovative events taking place. It's very unlikely as well that nightlife will really kick off as well. So any of those initial freshers kind of events that a lot of people go to, especially in the evening, are being replaced by a lot of daytime events. And so there might be things that are happening outdoors in ventilated spaces. So hopefully as well, it will mean that students who perhaps don't like to go and do those nighttime activities will actually have some other opportunities. A lot of times Freshers Week is based around that nighttime kind of going out and meeting everybody for the first time. So hopefully actually something positive to come out of this is that there are going to be more of those daytime activities that you can get involved in, and certainly Freshers Fair is going to be a way to kind of see what other opportunities there are. Also, a lot of student unions in particular as well, or other organisations are promoting now what the events are going to be. So I would certainly recommend finding out what some of those events are going to be, and perhaps planning a little bit of your kind of Freshers Week, or if you're returning to university, what the first couple of weeks might look like for you, and getting stuck in and getting involved, because certainly we don't want people to feel like they can't get involved.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, it's definitely a sort of a concern. I can especially really sympathise for anyone coming in as a fresher, because there's so many things that normally happen in your first term that aren't seeming like they're going to happen in the same way at the very least. So Abby said on this topic in the chat, with the student house I'm in, I'm worried about how safe my housemates will be. I'm worried about the peer pressure to go out too regularly. By that meaning both nightlife and also things like shopping and just going out the house. And I'm worried there's going to be peer pressure to do that when I'm not comfortable to do so. Do you suggest anything to do with this kind of thing? So, I mean, yeah, peer pressure is definitely something that, you know, we identified as being an issue. Although the guidelines from the government about social distancing are relatively clear now, you know, people have different exact interpretations of that. People are more or less worried than other people, and therefore more or less likely to stick to the regulations. So I know that's something I'm worried about, that I am, you know, concerned that my friends who I'm social bubbling with might go out and not tell me, and then they might be ill and bring it back to the flat. And also the peer pressure for me to go with them when actually it's something that I'm not comfortable to do. Like, I'm not comfortable yet going to sort of like an indoor bar, because I just don't think when people drink that they're as good as social distancing. And in an indoor space, it's harder to move away from people. So, I mean, personally, it's one of those things where there's not a lot of advice other than just I really do sympathise with you, because I think it's an issue for a lot of people, even, you know, beyond the sort of disability world. Just some people are far more nervous about coronavirus than others, and that does mean that people act in different ways, and there can be a lot of peer pressure to do certain things that you might not be comfortable with yet. We also kind of under this identified that on the other side, some students who aren't visually impaired themselves but are very, very worried about coronavirus might not really understand why a visually impaired person can't social distance properly, especially if that visually impaired person doesn't use a white cane or a guide dog or some obvious visual indicator of their impairment. And, you know, we might need to prepare as visually impaired students to be saying to people, look, you know, I'm really sorry I got too close to you. I can't see well enough to maintain the distance. You know, in future, just shout if I'm getting too close. And that's what I'm planning to do. I don't know, I imagine this is something you've come across as well so far, Will and Molly as well.
Certainly from our perspective as well, it's everyone is at different stages. I've been talking to lots of colleagues over you know, the last kind of few weeks, because as universities kind of open back up, you probably gathered as well that a lot of staff members are working remotely at the moment, and that's happening across not just universities, that's happening everywhere across the economy. But as we open up in September, staff members are also returning to campus, and in fact next week is the first time that I go back into my office since before the lockdown started. And we're all at different stages, staff in universities as well. Now, I can't speak about the, going out into the community and shopping and those activities, but certainly when it comes to universities, it's not just students that will be feeling a sense of anxiety, it's staff as well. So you're not alone, and students aren't alone as a group as well. It's everyone together as a community. And to say as well, when it comes to others that you're with, it might be useful to have that conversation, and a very honest conversation quite early on. If you feel confident and up to it, don't ever feel pressured that you have to have that conversation. But you might want to outline some rules that you might have in your house, sort of like a little agreement almost. A lot of people do this anyway when they're thinking about who's going to do the cleaning, who's going to take the bins out, all that kind of stuff. But maybe think about adding a few more things into that. Thinking about, cleaning, how often you're going to clean. Are we going to up the cleaning? What are we going to use to clean? In terms of the shared facilities, what are we all going to do when we finish? You mentioned about the bleach. Make sure that gets put away properly, and just have that conversation. And also do share your concerns with those who you feel comfortable with, because we recognise there's going to be all these challenges around the physical world that we're going to have to go about, but there's also our mental health and our well-being that we must prioritise as well. And this is going to be a time when things like our mental health are going to take the spotlight at different points, and we must make sure that we do something about that, whether that's a meditation, or that's speaking to somebody, or it's going out and asking for support and help. Making sure that you do reach out and you have those conversations. It is difficult at times, but we are all going to be slowly going through this together, and just know that you're not the only one. There are others out there who will be feeling the similar pressures, similar anxieties, and there are going to be people out there who can help.
Thanks for that, Will. I think there's the point about sort of looking after our mental health as well is really important. And most universities I know of have either a counselling service or some sort of system where you can access student counselling. And I would say, really do take advantage of that if it's something that you can access, because, these are very difficult times for a lot of people. And when you're having to manage all of the changes that everyone in the world is managing on top of your disability, it can be quite a lot to deal with, and just having a chat to someone about that is a really positive thing to do. So we have a comment in the chat from Tina about this, saying, I've seen how social distancing and staying safe does not work at all in social settings. I'm majorly concerned about this. This is something I've noticed as well. The one-way systems that have been set up in Oxford around the city, no one follows at all, because often they're on the wrong side of the pavement to access a certain shop. And partly I was very concerned because there's less social distancing, but part of me was also slightly relieved because it meant that if I got the one-way system wrong, I wasn't the only one getting it wrong. And it helped me in some ways. I felt a little bit less pressure to be able to follow all of these one-way systems when loads of people who can see them perfectly well are not following them. Obviously, ideally, we want everyone to social distance better, but it did make me feel like people were less likely to have a go at me for going the wrong way around a pavement or something like that. I know universities are, planning advertising to really encourage students to follow social distancing guidelines and stay as safe as possible, but at the end of the day, people will make their individual decisions, and if people are not social distancing and that's something that's really uncomfortable for you, especially if they're people that you live with, I think the only way to handle that is to have a conversation with them. I think Will's probably covered that pretty well so far. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
We always encourage students to have that conversation in any year, if you can feel possible, because it's just so much easier to explain to people. I mean, you'll find blind and visually impaired, it's such a low incidence disability. There'll be a huge number of people, a majority of the time you'll be moving in with people who have no experience of living alongside a blind or visually impaired person and don't really understand what that can impact, particularly as there is such a wide spectrum of visual impairment and different conditions that affect people in different ways. It is complex, and if you've had no experience, it can be sort of intimidating, or you just don't really know where to start. So it can be really helpful if you do have the confidence to have a conversation early on. Some things that we mention in more normal years are things like keeping shared spaces clear so there's nothing to trip over, making sure that worktops are clear, and making sure that you don't move other people's things, because as a visually impaired person, if you leave some things in a certain position, you want to know it's going to be there when you return to use it next time. And I think, if anything, that's just elevated this year. If that can apply to also things like disinfectant you're going to use to wipe over worktops, if it can apply to the bleach that you're going to be using to clean that shared bathroom, it just means that you can be confident in that you can look after yourself, and that the people around you have a kind of basic understanding, and just it puts that thought in their mind then, of just consciously making sure that everything's put back and that things are kept clear and tidy and out of the way, so that you minimise cross-contamination and kind of unnecessary contact with other people's belongings. So yeah, that's something that we recommend anyway, and can just kind of be stepped up again this year to kind of express any concerns that you might have with regards to hygiene.
Thanks for that, Molly. There's just one more thing that we had listed down to talk about under this section, and that's to do with what you do if you actually think you might have coronavirus. And for those of you that don't know, the government testing system is that you can go to a test centre and get a test, or you can be sent a test in the post. Both of those have some issues for visually impaired people. If you're going to a test centre, then unless you happen to live right next to one, then how do you get there? You're obviously not supposed to use public transport if you suspect you might have coronavirus, but equally, even those who you're social bubbling with should social distance from you if you suspect you may have it, in which case they can't drive you if they drive, or shouldn't really even walk with you. And if you don't know the route, even if it's within walking distance, how do you get there? On the other hand, the kit that's sent in the post is not very accessible. The instructions are not very accessible at all. And again, the people who you're social bubbling with might not want to get close enough to help you, which is fair under the circumstances. So this is something that's worried me. Oxford is running a system where a kit will be sent to your room if you suspect you might have coronavirus. I've not actually seen the kits, but if I get one and I'm not able to use it by myself, what do I do then? So I think Will has some potential advice about this, if I pass over to you.
Yeah, certainly. So, yeah, again, it's another case. Different universities are doing things differently. But one thing that is constant across is certainly the whole of England and the UK as well, is the NHS service. And so if you request a test, it may be, depending on the NHS provider that you're with, that there is the option to have somebody come and actually administer the test for you. Now, it does change from different region to different areas, and typically this would be someone like a nurse who might come out and administer a test for those who are unable to either conduct a test themselves or make their way to a testing centre. So it's very key there that perhaps it's something you might want to do before you go to university or back to university, is just have a look at what the NHS provision is in that area in regards to testing, and whether or not you can request somebody to come out and administer a test. If they come out and administer a test, they will be in the, you've probably been told or experienced yourself, hopefully not, about all the PPE that there is available to them. So they will be using things like masks or also aprons, and if not full kind of hazmat gear kind of suits. It can be quite daunting as well when you kind of see them or encounter them when they're doing their testing in the community, because it does kind of feel like there's something outer worldly about them. But as they come and do their test, they will guide you through all the different steps that you would need to do for the test, so you should feel safe. It may also be that you are requested to go to a doctor's or something like that. If it is something that you're familiar with or a location you're familiar with, you may be asked to go there.
Thanks for that. So we're kind of coming towards the end of our time, although Abby's just put in the chat, you can also ring the number, I think 119, but check that, with the test, and they will help you go through it and register your kit. So that's possibly a good intermediate if you can manage some of the testing kit at home but not all of it, or there's a particular instruction that you're not sure about. They might be able to go over that with you over the phone. So that's a really good point, actually. Thank you, Abby. That's everything we had written down, and I don't think there are any more questions that I can see. And we're sort of coming towards 5 o'clock now. So, I mean, first of all, I'd really like to thank Will and Molly for sort of answering most of these questions. And also thank everyone who's come along to listen and contribute questions and advice. I think really the main takeaway from all of this is that getting in touch with your university, particularly the disability services at your university, but also your faculty and people involved in your accommodation as early as possible is probably the most important thing to do, because you can have all of the things set up that could happen in the world, but if you haven't communicated that to people, then they don't know what you need. So it's always my first bit of advice to everyone is to get in contact with the disability services at your universities. And I'm sure Look and Thomas Pocklington will be happy to help if you have concerns and you have a situation you don't know how to deal with. Both have really good sort of advice to give. We have put together some useful resources which will be sent out to everyone and shared with the when this is released, the recording is released, they'll be shared along with the notes. So one of them is the Thomas Pocklington COVID-19 student support document, which I think is being updated sort of quite literally as we speak, and should be a really good bit of guidance for universities to know how to best support visually impaired students. There's also the NatSIP general guidance for higher education, which is just generally about visual impairment in higher education, but not so much coronavirus specific. HAB-VI have produced some guidance on mobility support for visually impaired students. And the final thing is Student Space, which is a really good collaborative mental health program, which is aiming to support students through the very unique circumstances surrounding the coronavirus pandemic. Epidemic, not sure what the difference is. I should know that. I'm a medical student. So that's also a really good thing to check out, because as Will said and I talked about, you know, we also need to consider our mental health at times like these. There are lots of changes and that can be really quite overwhelming, and starting university or returning to university is a really big thing anyway, even if there wasn't a global pandemic. So definitely check those resources out, and also, as I've said, you can get in contact with Look and TPT. So I'm just going to pass back to Ellen, who's just going to kind of round off everything. So I'm just going to say thanks very much to everyone.
Firstly, massive thank you to Tiri, Will and Molly for being such fantastic panelists this afternoon. There's been so much information shared, so many questions answered and so many different topics discussed. I hope everyone's found it really helpful. And yeah, really thank you all for coming as well and for contributing your questions and thoughts to the discussion. It's been really useful. As Tiri said, please do stay in touch with ourselves, Look, or Thomas Pocklington Trust should you have any more questions or worries about going back to university. And also, as Will and Molly and Tiri have sort of consistently said throughout this event, the really important point as well is to communicate with your own university and with your own disability services. So should you need any support with that, we're always here to help, but that's a really good way of making sure that your needs are met, is to communicate them. So just finally, just a couple of things about other ways that you can get involved with us. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have our mentoring project, which is also has a specific university students mentoring strand. So that's open to any visually impaired young people wanting a mentor, and that all takes place online. So very socially distanced. That is available to anyone for free, so please get in touch with us for more information about that. We're also currently running a free counselling service for for people, anyone over the age of 18 who's either visually impaired or connected to someone who's visually impaired in any way, so family member, friend, professional, and that's also free, so please get in touch with us for more information about that. And finally, more of our online events like these. So we are holding events like these quite often on a range of different topics. So please stay updated on our website and our social media to find out what we are getting up to. Our website is www.look-uk.org. So finally, just a big thank you again, and look out for the recording and the notes from this session being sent out to you very soon.